Last night, new Twitter owner Elon Musk personally just made the decision to ban Kanye West from Twitter after West had spent the day on Alex Jones's program saying things like, "I like Hitler," and pointing out the many things he apparently admires about Nazis. After he was done with Jones's show, West posted this symbol to his Twitter account with 33 million followers. It appears to combine the Nazi swastika with the Star of David. Shortly thereafter, Musk told West, both on Twitter and by personal text, that he had gone, quote, too far. And Kanye was then locked out of his Twitter account at some point last night, even though the account itself remains up. Both before and after Musk purchased Twitter, he repeatedly proclaimed himself to be, in his words, a free speech absolutist. One such instance was when he was explaining why he rejected pressure from various powerful sectors to block Russian news sources such as RT from inclusion in SpaceX's Starlink satellites, a position similar to the one that this very platform, Rumble, took when it was pressured by many of the same state and journalistic sources to remove RT and Sputnik from its platform. And that's why RT continues to be found here on Rumble today, even though it's now illegal under EU law to platform that news site. Now, it's very easy for someone to define themselves as a, quote, free speech absolutist. Many people love to wear that cape. It's glorifying and it signals a lot about who the person is. But like any political slogan, it requires concrete definition, lest it be nothing more than an empty and meaningless signifier of virtue. Given that everyone wants and expects Twitter to prohibit at least some content, child pornography, doxing, commercial spam, what does it mean to declare oneself in this context to be a free speech absolutist? For me, free speech absolutism, a term I claim for myself as well, means allowing any and every political viewpoint to be heard. It is, of course, acceptable to ban certain kinds of verbal expression that does not qualify as political viewpoints, such as defamation or fraud or direct threats of violence made person to person to an individual. But free speech, to me, means that every political opinion, even the most repugnant and horrifying, in fact, I would say especially the most repugnant and horrifying, is free to be expressed, and that no centralized authority is empowered to ban or punish its expression. Unlike most people who apply this term to themselves, Musk, to his credit, has defined what he means by it. He wrote back in April, quote, "By free speech, I simply mean that which matches the law. That which matches the law. I am against censorship that goes far beyond the law. If people want less free speech, they will ask their government to pass laws to that effect. Therefore, going beyond the law while censoring is contrary to the will of the people." In other words, by free speech absolutism, Musk said he would only ban content which could be or has been made illegal by the government. So, for example, child pornography and fraud can be banned since that has been made criminal by the government, but expressing arguably racist and homophobic views, harshly criticizing Israel or even Jews, disagreeing with gender ideology, that cannot be banned on Twitter, according to Musk, because the law does not prohibit its expression. Agree with that or not, that's a coherent and easy to understand standard for how Musk said he intends to govern Twitter. Now, whether Musk realizes it or not, this is not the standard that he is now using for determining what is and is not permitted on Twitter. Over the last week, there have been numerous instances in which several liberal left accounts, including a Meteor Matters goon and some people affiliated with Antifa, had their accounts suspended despite the fact that their offending tweets could not reasonably be interpreted as illegal. The account of the Meteor Matters operative was quickly restored without comment when liberals complained, but others remained banned. Elon Musk's prior refusal to reinstate the account of Alex Jones and Nick Fuentes, which were accounts that had been banned under the old Twitter regime, had already raised valid doubts about whether Musk really was prepared to live up to the free speech principles he espoused. Fuentes has never been found by a court to have violated the law for things he said, and while Alex Jones was successfully sued in a civil court by the parents of Sandy Hook students, that was not a criminal conviction, nor was it for things that he said or did on Twitter. Unless Musk is prepared to ban everyone with a criminal record or has ever been successfully sued for defamation, this refusal to reinstate those two accounts made little sense, except as a decision by Musk to prohibit any views to be heard on Twitter that are not just controversial, but deeply repugnant to a large number of people, or at least to Musk personally. The exact same standard, at least in principle, that the pre-Musk Twitter and Facebook and YouTube already use when censoring. Even if Musk ends up applying this framework with a somewhat lighter touch, it's the same framework. Any lingering doubts about whether Musk was living up to his own standard for what he means by free speech absolutism should have disappeared completely last night when Musk announced the banning of Kanye West. That's because nothing West said is even arguably illegal, as shocking as it is to hear someone enthusiastically professing their admiration for Adolf Hitler. Any attempt to prosecute Kanye West for any of those statements, the standard Musk said he would use when making censorship decisions on Twitter, would be immediately and easily struck down by courts as prohibited by the First Amendment. That Kanye West did nothing illegal with those statements is not a close call or even a debatable one. The so-called free speech absolutism movement emerged in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, in part due to Supreme Court rulings that invalidated as unconstitutional various state punishment that had been doled out to people who advocated communism, obviously widely regarded in the US as a repugnant ideology, similar to the way white supremacism and neo-Nazism are now regarded in the United States. Among the punishments found unconstitutional by the mid-20th century Supreme Court was banning anyone defending communism from practicing law or holding positions in state universities. This mounting Supreme Court defense of free speech in all its forms, even involving the most repugnant speech, culminated in the court's landmark unanimous 1969 decision in Brandenburg versus Ohio. The Brandenburg ruling continues to be the gold standard for free speech jurisprudence in the US. The facts leading up to that decision are simple. A Ku Klux Klan leader from rural Ohio, Clarence Brandenburg, stood up at a Klan rally and delivered a speech that advocated the justifiability of violence against the US government if it continued, in his view, to discriminate against white people. As the court explained, for that speech, he was arrested and then convicted under an Ohio law called the Ohio Criminal Syndicalism Statute that made it a crime to quote, advocate the duty, necessity, or propriety of crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform. In essence, Ohio had made it a crime to argue that the use of violence was justified in order to combat perceived government repression. A bit ironic for a country that was founded by people doing exactly that. The only question the Supreme Court faced, the only legal question it faced in this case, was whether the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech permitted Ohio to prosecute and then punish a citizen for advocating the use of violence to advance political ends. And that court ruled unanimously that while the state can permissibly criminalize the imminent incitement of violence, such as standing outside someone's home with a gathered mob of using torches and urging the mob or directing the mob to go burn down that person's house right then, something that would predictably result in immediate violence, the First Amendment protects the abstract advocacy of violence. As the court put it, quote, as we said in our prior ruling in Noto versus the United States, quote, the mere abstract teaching of the moral propriety or even moral necessity for a resort to force and violence is not the same as preparing a group for violent action and steeling it to such action. They went on. Accordingly, we are confronted with a statute which, by its own words and as applied, purports to punish mere advocacy and to forbid, on pain of criminal prosecution, assembly with others merely to advocate the described type of action. Such a statute falls within the condemnation of the First and 14th Amendments. In other words, even if Kanye West had vocally advocated the moral necessity of using violence against Jews, and as repugnant as his messaging was, he most certainly did not do that. But even if he had, he would still not have been saying anything that the law does or could outlaw. Now, it should go without saying, but unfortunately I do, it does not, that objecting to the censorship of a particular view does not require one to support the view itself. Put another way, if someone questions whether Kanye West should have been banned from Twitter due to his remarks about Hitler, as I'm doing, then that does not mean, obviously, that one shares Kanye's professed admiration of Hitler. Anyone above the age of 8, I mean that literally, above the age of 8, should have no trouble understanding the distinction between defending the right of a person to advocate idea X and agreeing with idea X itself. Indeed, nobody back in 1969 believed or claimed that the 8 justices of the Supreme Court who invalidated the criminal conviction of Clarence Brandenburg so ruled because they secretly agreed with the Klan's white supremacy ideology. Everyone understood it was a ruling about the proper scope of free speech under the First Amendment. Those justices should count themselves very lucky that they never had to encounter modern-day left liberal political culture. Or else Thurgood Marshall, one of the justices who ruled that way, would have found himself being widely accused of supporting the Klan and of white supremacy as a result of that ruling, much the way that Clarence Thomas today so often is. This simple but vital distinction when it comes to discussing free speech was perhaps most vividly illustrated in the famous 1978 case where ACLU lawyers, overwhelmingly, in fact, almost all entirely Jewish and leftist, defended the right of the American Nazi Party to hold a march through the town of Skokie, Illinois, a town chosen by those Nazis precisely because it was a town filled with Holocaust survivors. The ACLU represented the Nazi Party, and on their behalf sued the city of Skokie and won because the city had denied the Nazi Party a parade permit. Now, nobody minimally rational thought the Jewish leftists of the ACLU were Nazi sympathizers. They found the Nazi speech as repellent as anyone else, obviously, but they were defending a principle. And by doing so, they almost caused the bankruptcy of the ACLU by driving away so many Jewish donors and supporters who were horrified by the principled stand they had taken in behalf of free speech. Here's how the group today describes the principle they defended back then. Quote, in 1978, the ACLU took a controversial stand for free speech by defending a neo-Nazi group that wanted to march through the Chicago suburb of Skokie, where many Holocaust survivors lived. The notoriety of the case caused some ACLU members to resign, but had come to represent the ACLU's unwavering commitment to principle. In fact, many of the laws the ACLU cited to defend the Nazi Party's right to free speech and assembly were the same laws it had invoked during the Civil Rights era, when Southern cities tried to shut down civil rights marches with similar claims about the violence and disruption the protests would cause. A very similar controversy involving the ACLU erupted just a few years ago in 2017 when the ACLU of Virginia sued the city of Charlottesville for denying a permit to various stripes of white nationalists and others who wanted to march. Many liberals and others on the left directed extreme rage at the ACLU when that rally resulted in the murder of a counter-protester, Heather Heyer, when one of the white nationalists plowed his car into a group of people in which he was standing. But unlike 1978, when the ACLU vehemently defended the principle they were defending, this new and much less principled iteration of the ACLU all but apologized for what they had done and issued new regulations to appease its critics, rules that make it harder for the ACLU to defend the free speech rights of unpopular groups in the future. The longtime executive director of the ACLU, back when it was still a genuine free speech group, Ira Glasser, who helped steer the group past the Skokie controversy and resigned 20 years later, right before the 9/11 attack, has become a vehement critic of the new ACLU for what he regards as its subordination of principled civil liberties stands in order to become a standard liberal and Democratic Party partisan activist group. When I interviewed Glasser in 2020 about the ACLU's position in both the Skokie case and the controversy surrounding its actions in Charlottesville, this is what he told me about why real free speech absolutism, the kind that doesn't bend or break when it comes to the most repellent views and the attacks one provokes by defending the right to express them, is now more vital than ever.
The larger question that you're raising is a question of the young generation of activists who seem to believe that the cause of social justice requires opposition to the First Amendment. And they come to think that their fight for social justice and the right of free speech are antagonists because they take their own right of free speech for granted, and they see their opponent's free speech as a threat, and they want it stopped. And the analogy that I always use in talking about this is poison gas. And when you've got some real enemies out in front of you, and they seem to be advancing on you, and they seem maybe to even outnumber you, and you have some poison gas, and you've got them in your sights, it's very tempting to use it. You want to use it. So you start using it. And then the wind shifts. And
that crucial recognition expressed and explained so well there by Ira Glasser, that if you support censorship when it comes to views you hate, such as the things Kanye West has been saying over the last several days or weeks, will eventually be used against the views you like, is exactly why the free speech absolutism of the old noble ACLU was supported by the civil rights leaders of that era and others who felt vulnerable, because they knew that if they endorsed a framework of censorship due to their hatred of Nazis, that framework of censorship would then be turned on to them. Something to think about as you think about whether you are happy that Kanye West has been banned from Twitter. Beyond the ACLU, one of the most influential left-wing figures of the 20th century and now into the 21st century is the MIT linguist, scholar, and anti-war activist Noam Chomsky. Chomsky provoked significant amounts of rage among the left toward him, especially the European left, due to his defense of free speech rights of a French professor in 1979. That professor, Robert Farson, was a well-respected tenured professor of literature at a French public university when he began, in his words, studying the Holocaust, and started questioning and then denying the existence of gas chambers and other Nazi atrocities, resulting in threats to terminate his tenured job as a literature professor. Chomsky, who had lost most of his family in those same Nazi camps, signed a letter along with 600 or so other public intellectuals denouncing the attempts to have Farson fired for his views. Part of that letter read, quote, "We strongly protest these efforts to deprive Professor Farson of his freedom of speech and expression, and we condemn the shameful campaign to silence him. We strongly support Professor Farson's just right of academic freedom, and we demand that university and government officials do everything possible to ensure his safety and the free exercise of his legal rights." Chomsky's free speech rights of this professor turned him for a long while into a pariah among the left, especially the European left, which never did and still does not believe in free speech. He did not visit France for decades after that episode happened, and to this day, he vehemently defends what he did and continues to be one of the few prominent voices on the international left who still defends free speech. Chomsky, after all, was one of the signers of the now notorious Harper's Letter in 2020, along with J.K. Rowling, Salman Rushdie, Malcolm Gladwell, and many others, that warned that, quote, "The free exchange of information and ideas, the lifeblood of a liberal society, is daily becoming more constricted," and went on. "It is now all too common to hear calls for swift and severe retribution in response to perceived transgressions of speech and thought." In this extraordinary and highly important video I'm about to show you, Chomsky confronted a wide array of angry French activists and students and explained the reasons he defended even the rights of this Holocaust-denying professor to be heard and not be punished by the state.
I do not think that the state ought to have the right to determine historical truth and to punish people who deviate from it. I'm not willing to give the state that right, even if they happen to
But are you denying that the gas chambers never existed?
But I'm saying if you believe in freedom of speech, you believe in freedom of speech for views you don't like. I mean, Goebbels was in favor of freedom of speech for views he liked, right? So was Stalin. If you're in favor of freedom of speech, that means you're in favor of freedom of speech precisely for views you despise. Otherwise, you're not in favor of freedom of speech. There's two positions you can have on freedom of speech, and you can decide which position you want. With regard to my defense of the utterly offensive, the people who express utterly offensive views, I haven't the slightest doubt that every commissar says, "You're defending that person's views." No, I'm not. I'm defending his right to express them. The difference is crucial, and the difference has been understood outside of fascist circles since the 18th century.
Is there anything?
Now, note two vital points that Chomsky makes here. The first is that censorship advocates always resort to the cheap and intellectually bankrupt tactic of accusing free speech defenders of secretly agreeing with the views of those whose free speech rights they defend, as I'm certain people are going to do with this very video when accusing me of obviously secretly sympathizing with Kanye West's admiration of Hitler simply because I'm questioning whether or not his views and those of others like him should be prohibited from Twitter. But the second point Chomsky makes there is even more important. And that is that when it comes to free speech, there are only two views one can have. There's not a third view, there's not a fourth view, there's not a fifth view. There's no gradations when it comes to free speech. There are only two positions. One either supports the right for the full range of political opinions to be freely expressed, or one supports censorship. Those in that second group may disagree about where that censorship line should be drawn. Some think it should be drawn at transphobia, others think it should be drawn at racism, others think it should be drawn at anti-Semitism, but as a matter of principle, it's all censorship advocacy. They may quibble about where the censorship should be, but ultimately they're defending censorship. One either supports the right to express even the most repellent views, such as the things Kanye West is saying, or one is a censor. There's no third alternative. Why does that point matter so much? Because everyone loves to proclaim themselves a supporter of free speech. At least in the US, you almost never hear anyone stand up and say, I oppose free speech, or I support censorship, when it's clearly the case that they do. Nobody wants to admit that about themselves. So it's very easy to recite free speech bromides. And it's often easy to apply free speech, particularly when it comes to defending people who are targeted with censorship for expressing views that you either share or at least don't find particularly offensive. The new pro-free speech camp in the United States, as represented by people whom then New York Times writer Barry Weiss famously dubbed the intellectual dark web, began as opposition to so-called cancel culture. Weiss called it the dark web because, according to her, these people espouse ideas that are prohibited in decent society. Here's what she wrote, quote, "Here are some things that you will hear when you sit down to dinner with the vanguard of the intellectual dark web. There are fundamental biological differences between men and women. Free speech is under siege. Identity politics is a toxic ideology that is tearing American society apart. And we're in a dangerous place when these ideas are considered, quote, dark." Those aroused by the emergence of this dissident faction, the intellectual dark web, subsequently rose in defense of people such as Jordan Peterson, Abigail Shrier, Sam Harris, Brett and Eric Weinstein, J.K. Rowling, and Barry Weiss herself. But at the end of the day, it wasn't particularly hard to do. As someone who defends their right to express those views, I never found it difficult. That's because such people may be anathema to very liberal venues, such as the most leftist wings of academia. You won't see Jordan Peterson or people like him who aggressively defend the new gender ideology dogma appear on Meet the Press. You won't see Abigail Shrier or Chris Rufo writing op-eds in the New York Times. You won't see Eric Weinstein with offers to teach at Yale. That's because they do advocate views that are unwelcome in certainly particularly progressive venues. But it's not as though any of them are saying the sorts of things that most of society finds repellent, the way Kanye West is now doing or the way Nick Fuentes regularly does. Nothing they say can be characterized reasonably as residing so far outside the bounds that they have been turned into pariahs or untouchables or people who have had their careers and livelihoods destroyed. Not even close. If anything, most of those in the so-called intellectual dark web or precincts adjacent to it have gone on to previously unthinkable new heights of popularity, fame, and wealth. Barry Weiss may not appear on Face the Nation, but she appears quite frequently on Bill Maher's HBO program, and is someone whom world leaders such as Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu feel perfectly comfortable being interviewed by, as he did this week. J.K. Rowling's books are selling quite well and are still being made into films. People like Jordan Peterson, Dave Rubin, and my friend Matt Taibbi are surely not welcome to many liberal circles, but they're still thriving quite well because they're welcomed in many. As Chomsky explained in that video we just showed you, and as any real free speech absolutist will affirm by definition, the real test, the real one, for whether one actually believes in free speech is not found in the easy cases or the marginal cases, the ones where you object to the censorship of people you like and agree with, or even who have views that may not be yours but are still perfectly acceptable in decent society. The real test of whether someone believes in free speech or not comes from whether you defend the free speech rights of those who express repellent views, one that border on being universally reviled, whose advocates are canceled in every sense of the word, whose views aren't just rejected by some in the population, but virtually everyone in prominence, power, and position. It was not lost on me that one of the earliest and most prominent leaders of this so-called intellectual dark web, Sam Harris, very quickly became one of the most vocal supporters of the shunning and cancellation of Kanye West. According to Harris, Kanye deserves to have lost all of his contracts and platforms and never to be seen again. Something he said before the last comments on Alex Jones's program. He said this weeks ago, due to no reason other than the views that Kanye West expressed or one Sam Harris finds sufficiently repellent to punish him. And then Harris quit Twitter due to Elon Musk's reinstatement of both Kanye West and Donald Trump. What an odd avatar of a movement claiming to oppose cancellation, of favoring full and open inquiry, and to abhor censorship above all else. Now, part of that might just be special pleading by Sam Harris on behalf of one's own group. Like free speech, it's somewhat easy to minimize and scoff at accusations of bigotry that are directed at other groups, one to which you are not a member. But among the luminaries of the intellectual dark web, there has always been a quite noticeable and quite abrupt shift in how things like bigotry accusations and cancellations are discussed when the subjects shift from accusations of racism, misogyny, homophobia, Islamophobia, transphobia, and the like, to accusations of anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel, where the hair-trigger reactions of being offended and seeking safe spaces that they usually mock suddenly shape how they speak, now that their own group, the one which forms a significant part of their identity, is the target rather than those other groups. But when it comes to people like Sam Harris, last seen arguing that the media and CIA lies about Hunter Biden were justified in light of what he regards as the profound importance of doing everything possible to defeat Donald Trump, when it comes to people like him, this is clearly a case of someone who likes to drape themselves in the glorifying banner of free speech absolutism, yet immediately abandons it when the heat is turned just a little too high and the views being censored are one the persons themselves find so repugnant that they suddenly believe that repression is not just permissible, but necessary. When it comes to free speech, most people, from woke censors on the left and the luminaries of the IDW, have their limits. The limits may be defined differently. Woke warriors on the left are more horrified by racist and transphobic statements, while the IDW leaders are more horrified by anti-Semitism. But ultimately, they're both people who do not believe in free speech, at least in its most absolute form, which, as Chomsky said, is the only form. And people like this who call others censors, who, in fact, are no different than they, except that their limits for wanting to outlaw certain political views are placed in a different location than those they scorn as censored. The problem for them and us is that, to quote Chomsky, uttered while he was in the middle of a global storm of outrage, a serious fire for defending the academic freedom of a history professor accused of Holocaust denialism, quote, there are only two positions you can have on free speech, only two. It has long been clear that many of the leaders of the self-glorifyingly named intellectual dark web don't actually believe in the free speech they herald themselves for embracing, since they abandon it so quickly when it comes to ideas and views they personally find repugnant. And even more importantly, it is starting to appear that Elon Musk can be classified the same way. Like the people he mocks as woke censors, he seems willing, at least up to this point, to defend the right of free expression, to oppose censorship, only up to the point that ideas become too repugnant for his personal taste. As the journalist Michael Tracy put it earlier today, quote, saying a bunch of wild stuff about a reviled historical figure, Hitler, is not, quote, incitement to violence by any coherent standard. Kanye just proved that the standard for getting banned on Twitter is apparently still, if enough people think what you're saying is really bad. Kanye West, I believe deliberately, tested Elon Musk's self-description of as a free speech warrior. And though it was admittedly a hard test, Musk failed it. And thus, Kanye West, despite not having violated any law, is now banned from Twitter. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.